Hello, welcome back everyone. We are ready to get going with today's event, which is around Category 2 of the Organizational Standards and Community Engagement. Again, I am Cashin Yu from the Community Action Partnership, and we will be joined in just a few minutes with Tiffany Marley, also at the Community Action Partnership and one of the primary writers on this particular section. So just a little bit of info to get us started, what we plan to do today. We'll talk about the TA guide. In this particular case, Category 2 is not yet released as of the recording of this on September 17th, but will be out within the next week or two. But there will be a technical assistance guide for all 9 of the categories. So we'll review a little bit about how that guide is structured, how it relates to the series as a whole. We'll talk a little bit about conducting a review process for these standards. So we have some tips and some thoughts around how you might want to use this to not only think about compliance with the organizational standards, but how can you use this as an opportunity to really partake in some organizational development. And then we'll discuss the actual standards in this category, 2.1 through 2.4 for community engagement, and that will be the bulk of our discussion today that Tiffany will be leading us through. We have questions here. It doesn't necessarily have to be at the end. Yes, it's at the end of our agenda here, but we do encourage you to put those questions in at any time. What we have been doing is actually pausing after each standard to take a moment to see if there are any questions or thoughts that have come in around that particular topic. So please do put those in the Q&A box at any point in time. So these TA guides, there's actually kind of a two-part purpose to each of these guides. The first is to assist with the definition, intent, and documentation of the standards. So that's section A and B, and when you see the guides themselves, community assessment is already out if you want to take a look to see how it's going to be structured. Section A covers that definition and intent. So here's where we put forth what the CSBG working group and the Community Action Partnership was kind of thinking behind the scenes. It's a expansion on what has already been put into the assessment tools that have been out for the past year. And that's also where we go ahead and link you to any best practices, studies, case law, CSBG Act, circulars, any of that information to tie that back to why this standard, why is it worded this way, why is it important. And then that section B talks about interpretation and documentation. So that's where we really get into what kinds of documents will you need to be able to prove that you're meeting this standard, as well as we go through some questions that you may want to look at to make sure that you are interpreting the standard the same way that we are. We kind of try to think about what kinds of problems may you encounter as you go through this. So we're trying to tell the future a little bit, but it is based on a lot of what we have heard from the field. So all of that, section A and B, really is about the compliance with the standards and really helping you and supporting you in that assessment. Parts C and D in each of the guides are completely voluntary, but we are trying to give you some framework to start thinking beyond compliance and start thinking about how are you performing in this area. So section C provides some diagnostic questions to kind of help you figure out how well you're doing or to push yourself a little bit further. And then section D provides resources. So sometimes they are back to the original things like IMs or the Act, but a lot of them are just good resources that are either from the network or from the nonprofit world in general to really help you improve your processes or find some further reading. And one other note before I move into the assessment process itself, there is a Likert scale that is at the end of each of our guides. So first there'll be kind of a blank page where you can use that as a cover sheet in your assessment, so you can put down what documents did you use. You can put in information of notes about where you fell along that continuum, as well as put things like who's responsible, what date, and even if you're already to the point of you're putting that file together before you are assessed by your state lead agency, you know, what page number or that kind of thing. The back side of that is that 5-point scale. So 3 in the middle is satisfactory, and that is the letter of the standards. So we have 1 and 2, unacceptable and unsatisfactory, sorry, which are to help you figure out, you know, are you missing by a little or a lot to see, you know, what kind of work needs to be done. But of course, we're hoping that most people will be thinking about that 3, satisfactory, and then 4 and 5, advancing and outstanding, which gives you some room to start thinking about how can I improve my process and make sure that we're in that best practice mode. Again, that is completely voluntary. That is an internal process to you as an agency to help benchmark yourself. That is not part of the assessment process by your state monitor. All right, so next up, we do want to put in a few considerations for the review process. So I would encourage you to think about how you are actually going to structure at your particular organization, making sure that you are in compliance with the standards. I think that you have the ability to say, you know, here's our standards day. We are looking at community engagement today, and we're going to just work on that. Honestly, I feel like that is probably the harder way to do it. The easier way is to start trying to think about how it's connected to processes that you're already doing or within the standards themselves. For example, I think there's a lot of things that the community engagement might work into your community assessment process, for example. So instead of making compliance with community engagement this whole separate activity, you may want to see how does that fit in with my community assessment that I already know I'm going to do to make sure that all the boxes are ticked off. Also, you may think about using a team approach to assessing against these standards. While I think you probably could manage it with a single person, I think that the process would probably be a little bit easier with a team. They bring in a lot of different experiences and data from different levels if you can really kind of get a management team, as well as, like I said, all the standards do fit together in some way. So putting your community engagement along with something such as the assessment or some of the data and analysis that you're doing just makes sense. You'll want to think about how your staff is determining how the standards are met. So step 1 of that is, of course, talking to your state CSBG lead agency to see are they having any regulations about what documentation they are going to accept, any interpretation or definitions that they have put out, because they are going to be the final arbiter on all of that. And then do you, as your whole team that is assessing, know what that means so that you're all looking for the same thing. The same would actually work for the documenting the compliance. So if, however you decide that you are going to put your documentation, you'll want that to be a strategy that is used across your entire agency. For example, some of the ones that we have seen have been to do the physical file folders with each of the categories laid out, and you have your highlighting or your post-it notes or something like that to show those important dates and actions. And that we see in people that are doing electronic files, either putting them through like a shared drive space, flash drives even that can be sent into your monitor. But however that is, you want to make sure that your assessment team, regardless of what category they are looking at, are documenting that in the same way. It's going to make your monitoring visit that much easier. And how are you going to manage recommendations? What's going to be your follow-up process? Once you've assessed, if you've by chance found that you are not meeting that particular standard, how are you going to move forward? By when? Who's going to be involved in that? And as well, if you are looking at that kind of beyond compliance piece and putting this as part of your organizational development, who's going to do what and when? Make sure there's a structured process for that. And last but not least, how will the staff archive results? This assessment process, because we are saying that a team approach is probably going to be your easiest. This is an annual assessment of organizational standards, so it may not be the exact same team next year. So you're going to want to make sure that you have some notes about how this process was actually accomplished. What did you find, what worked, what didn't work, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel each and every year. All right, so if you're thinking about that kind of going beyond compliance, I think the first step that you can do for that is, of course, to use that assessment scale that is at the back of each of those guides. I would actually recommend that regardless of whether you're planning on doing some of these next steps that I talk about, just because it gives you a great place to kind of benchmark where you are each year. But once you've filled that out and you're trying to move up that ladder, you can also try to put in things that you can do to try to move beyond that with discussing that as a group. Maybe it might be a great way to do that is that it's structured into a staff meeting or into, if you have like strategic kind of days or staff days, anything like that. Try to just talk about what are our strengths and what are the opportunities for improvement that we've found by going through this process. Another piece of discussion, we'll be going through those resource materials. So we have all of this guide. We have resource sections in each guide, so there will be extra reading. So I would encourage you to maybe make that part of your kind of moving beyond to figure out where you want to go. A little bit more involved would be to talk about doing maybe some interviews or focus groups, either internally with key staff or with outside partners or consultants and experts, just to figure out, where are we, how do we benchmark, across community action agencies, how are we perceived in our community, how are we against the rest of the nonprofit sector. So with that, I think that gets everything that we're going to do about the overall kind of feel of this. And I'm going to be handing it over to Tiffany Marley, who is the project director of our Learning Communities Resource Center here at the Community Action Partnership. But she is one of the primary writers on the upcoming technical assistance guide. So she's actually going to be the one walking us through 2.1 through 2.4. So with that, Tiffany, you are unmuted, and the ball is yours to take it away.
Thank you very much, Cashin. Appreciate that overview, which sets the stage for us quite well. And so let's go ahead and jump into our first standard, Standard 2.1. The organization has documented or demonstrated partnerships across the community for specifically identified purposes. Partnerships include other anti-poverty organizations in the area. The thing to keep in mind as it relates to Standard 2.1, especially as it relates to the definition and intent, are that, one, this standard is specifically speaking to what we all are familiar with, that is community partnerships. And in particular, as it relates to those partnerships, many of the agencies have existing partnerships that span the community. Those typically are diverse partnerships, but the true intent of this standard is to promote or to support the development of more formalized partnerships that address more specific purposes for the community. The other thing to keep in mind is that this standard intends to go beyond what is required in the IS report. In the IS report, it requires that partners or those community relationships are listed, but this takes that aspect to another level, and as I said, it speaks to that specific focus for that partnership, and in some cases, it demonstrates a mutually beneficial relationship between the agency and the partner organization. And so some specific examples of purposes might include, but are not limited to, shared projects, community collaborations or coalitions related to an identified topic, for example, focused on domestic violence or homelessness, teen pregnancy prevention, transportation task forces, community economic development projects, etc. Or those relationships might be contractual relationships where the agency and another organization may have a contract to coordinate their services. And so the key thing to also remember is there is no right way to approach this standard, and so we're just offering you some possible scenarios that might help you to achieve this particular expectation. So some examples might be that the Community Action Agency is a lead agency on a teen pregnancy project and has subcontracted with other agencies to address needs in that particular area. Or another example might be that the Community Action Agency serves as a subcontractor on a reentry project in which it is providing job skills training, and another community-based organization is the lead on the actual project. Or yet another example might be that the Community Action Agency facilitates a coalition on domestic violence and convenes community partners who are a part of an organized coalition, and its membership list may serve as documentation of these partnerships. And so there again, it's important to note that each of these are examples and they each speak to possible scenarios of relationships between the Community Action Agency and the partner organization, and the key in each of these is that there is a specifically identified purpose for these relationships. The other thing that it's important to note here is that the standard does not require that every partnership is a formal, fully documented relationship, but certainly it is promoting or encouraging that. And so as we think about just the overall definition of this particular standard, you'll be able to find it in the toolkit when the toolkit goes live, but there are several sources that we have drawn from that inspire the definition and the intent behind this standard. So those are found in the Economic Opportunity Act, Title II, Section 201A, that basically provides the basic purpose for community action agencies and programs as being resources to stimulate a better focusing of all available local, state, private, and federal resources upon the goal of enabling low-income families and low-income individuals of all ages in rural and urban areas to attain the skills, knowledge, and motivations, and to secure opportunities needed for them to become self-sufficient. Other sources are the Community Services Block Grant Act, which I won't quote, but you would see in the toolkit itself, as well as the Office of Economic Opportunity Instruction 6320-1 from 1970, And then Information Memorandum 49, which was issued in 2001, that also provides information as well. Actually, and I'll speak to that, I'm sorry, I got distracted by the siren in the background, but in essence, with the IM 49, it basically highlights something that's important to us in community action, and that is the 6 national goals, and goal number 4 in particular speaks to partnerships among supporters and providers of service to low-income people are achieved. So the intent of the standard is to ensure the minimum requirement for the basic requirements of community engagement. All right, so let's talk a little bit about guidance on compliance and documentation. In particular, a possible there are going to be scenarios that come up that might bring the agency's compliance or lack of compliance to the attention of the reviewers, and it's just an important thing for the agency as it maybe identifies potential challenges related to meeting the standard to remain in close communication with your state CSBG lead agency. I'll say that again, that it's important to seek the guidance from the state CSBG lead agency for interpretation related to whether the particular standard has been complied with or not. And so we offer some examples of possible scenarios that would possibly prompt further investigation or review as it relates to the agency's compliance. And one example is that the partnerships do not span the agency's entire service area. And so what we mean by this is many of our agencies serve multiple counties or broad regions per se, and in those cases where that is the case, it is important that you know, as it relates to the elements that sort of make up those individual communities, so whether it's a county or it could be a large metropolitan area that is sectioned off in distinctive communities, it's important for there to be partnerships or community relationships established in each of those to best be able to provide a holistic representation of community engagement on the part of the agency. Another scenario that might prompt further review might be that the purpose of the partnership is not clearly defined. And so, as we have already said, many agencies are accustomed to just listing what the partnerships are. So there just might be a very exhaustive list of partners that the agency has, but the key with this is that those partnerships must also be clearly identified. And so in those scenarios where that identification is not there, that may prompt further review. Additionally, another example might be that partnerships do not include anti-poverty organizations. The agency may be assessed or reviewed related to compliance. If this is not the case, and it's important that these relationships are strategic and support the agency's efforts to address the causes and conditions of poverty within the service area, and that these partnerships are clearly defined. But the key is that the engagement is also specifically with anti-poverty organizations within the community. And so the following might serve as documentation to show that an agency is in compliance with Standard 2.1. They might include MOUs or contracts and agreements, documented outcomes as a result of the established partnerships, and then coalition membership. And I've already referenced that the agency might even take the lead on facilitating a coalition, so attendance lists and things like that would serve as documentation. And so let's talk a little bit about beyond compliance. As the review process is occurring, and Cashin has already spoken to this quite well, but you know, just offer these points for us, and that is that it's important that the review team, the internal review team at the agency or the designated review team conduct a brief evaluation of the strengths and weaknesses of the existing community engagement process. The team might choose to conduct brief interviews with the primary staff who are responsible for establishing and maintaining agency partnerships to inquire about potential areas for improvement. And I like that word improvement because there's always room for improvement for all of our agencies, as we are not only talking about compliance but going beyond compliance. The other consideration would be to convene an evaluation meeting of key stakeholders involved in the current community engagement process to identify ways to improve future efforts. The review team can convene the meeting or just conduct brief interviews with program managers, board members, agency executives to gather feedback on lessons learned and how to effectively build and strengthen community partnerships. So on this next slide, there are some examples of questions that the review team might raise in those individual interviews or in the focus groups. These are suggestions, so not all of these have to be used, but certainly are available as a reference for the review team as the review team does its work. And I'll just state a few of these. I'm not going to state all of them, but they are all going to be contained in the actual toolkit itself. And so examples might be, do the existing formal partnerships align with the agency's strategic plan and community action plan? Do the existing formal partnerships support the agency's strategies, programs, and services? Has the agency identified all possible collaborations related to anti-poverty work within the service area and developed a clear strategy for engagement? Has the agency engaged in more long-term collaborations which have fostered more co-location activities, for example, bundled services, joint services, etc.? And so those are some examples of the questions which could be asked in the review process. And then the next slide provides a listing of available resources to just help strengthen community action agencies' understanding of the standard, but also some possible practical tools as it relates to implementing this standard effectively. So at this time, I'll pause to see if there are any questions. And Cashin, should you just read those to me?
I certainly can. We do have a couple that have come in. So first up, as a public CAA, which I did want to note that at this point in time, we are specifically talking about the standards for the private CAAs. However, there is not a whole lot of difference in these first couple of categories, community engagement included. But side note, as a public CAA, does contracting for anti-poverty client services with a delegate agency count as a demonstrated partnership of the community?
Did you say what was the adjective used again about the agency or organization? I missed that part, I'm sorry.
it's a public community action agency, and they do some contracting down to delegate agencies. Would that count as a demonstrated partnership?
I would venture to say yes. Yes, and so absolutely, as the organization or the agency is serving as the lead as it relates to a particular project or initiative, but yes, to have those MOUs or contracts in place that speak to what the community action agency might do, and then what the other subcontracting organization might do is definitely falls in line with this standard. Yeah, and that also provides just opportunity for individual organizations' strengths and resources to be leveraged, which at the end of the day increases everybody's potential for return on investment as well. Yeah.
Great, thanks. So next up, it's not exactly a question, it's more of a comment that in their particular regional service area, the CAA is the only organization that is actually identified as an anti-poverty organization. The others do services that address conditions of poverty. So there's not exactly a question in that, but I would want to point out that I think that you are, in fact, getting at the spirit of the standards. So yes, those may not be another comprehensive anti-poverty organization, but if they are kind of working in that arena, you would just be putting that in your specifically identified purpose that, okay, the food bank does help with the hunger issues for that same group of clientele.
Yes, I think that is well said. And the other important thing to note is that many of our community action agencies are the backbone anti-poverty entity in communities. And as you said, there may be organizations that sort of address the subsets or the conditions of poverty, but community action agencies are focused more so on sort of the comprehensive causes and conditions. And so, certainly those examples would be good examples of that kind of relationship. So yes, it supports the connection to the anti-poverty organization piece.
Great, and I think we had another question that came in the chat window that I think kind of goes in that same vein. Your bullet about partnerships being with anti-poverty organizations, most organizations that they work with do not actually use anti-poverty in their language. So what does that actually mean outside of the Community Action Network? And
yeah, I think that is a good question, and I always defer to an earlier statement that was made in the presentation. An aspect of this is going to be left to your interpretation, sort of based on what the mission or the focus or the kinds of things that organization is doing. But then, in addition to that, if there's a point of question about that, which so if there's a point of question about it, then you can totally rely on your state lead CSBG agency to help you define and clarify what that expectation looks like within your state and more specifically for your agency.
Great, thanks. And apparently we have several questions that are kind of in that anti-poverty word usage there. So someone was noting that they were confused on the guidance on the compliance and documentation about are we actually required to have partnerships with anti-poverty organizations? And the answer is yes. However, the anti-poverty, like I said, it doesn't have to be that quite as comprehensive or holistic. It could be, like I said, those homeless shelters, food banks, anyone that is also kind of working in that arena. So
right, your workforce development boards. I mean, many of our agencies, just by virtue of who we are and what we do in the community, are certainly connected, you know, with these kind of organizations already. And yes, it is the case that in certain communities, the infrastructure is more limited than in others. But, you know, I will emphasize and stress that, you know, in those areas where it doesn't seem so clear because of the limited infrastructure, it is a totally appropriate thing to negotiate those definitions with your state lead CSBG agency.
Great. So, yeah, I think we were kind of getting caught up a little bit in that anti-poverty language there. But, yeah, it really do check with your state CSBG office. And what this was meaning was making sure that you're all kind of presenting that united front, in a sense, to combat poverty. However, whatever conditions you are working on, it means, for example, you don't need to be a partner with, you know, Save the Rainforest of the Amazon. It's probably not going to do anything. It may be a worthy cause, but isn't going to be anti-poverty and tied into your community. So that's more what we were getting at. So with that, I think we actually got all the questions that were on 2.1. So now that you guys have found that Q&A box, keep them coming, and we're going to move to 2.2.
All right. Thank you very much. So standard 2.2, the organization utilizes information gathered from key sectors of the community in assessing needs, resources during the community assessment process or other time. These sectors would include, at a minimum, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, private sector, public sector, and educational institutions. And so, here's the thing to keep in mind. Most community action agencies have ongoing conversations with a myriad of organizations which span the sectors mentioned in this particular standard. And the thing to keep in mind is that this standard sort of supports the agency in its work to understand what those sectors, what they know, what they see, and what they do related to the community. Examples of these groups include, however, they're not limited to, but they include the following. So, for example, for community-based organizations, possible organizations that might be included would be the United Way, Salvation Army, and other multi-service nonprofits. The faith-based sector. Examples related to that might be local churches, synagogues, mosques, interfaith service organizations. Private sector. Examples might be our chambers of commerces, our local business improvement districts, etc. Public sector, our departments of social services, our public health departments. Educational institutions, examples might be our local school boards, universities, community colleges, and trade or educational institutions. This standard helps an agency answer an important question from the Roma Foundation, and that is, what does the customer value? What does the customer value? And related to this, it's just important for the agency to understand the makeup of their community at large, but to also understand community needs, available resources, and this is key, to understand available resources. So by having those relationships with those various sectors involved, it provides a foundation for potential community engagement partnerships, but also an opportunity for further exploration around how resources might be leveraged, given that, let's say, for example, the workforce development boards or the workforce development offices are certainly going to offer some key expertise and context related to job skills development and access of employment for members of the community. And at the same time, the Community Action Agency might be able to provide that family support or family advocacy base that sort of strengthens an individual's ability to sort of access more skills and to improve their employment situation. And so providing those supports through just coaching or transportation, you know, all the kinds of things, the different kinds of things that agencies do. But the point is that these relationships allow for a clear picture to be painted regarding available resources, but also a clear picture painted regarding the barriers to achieving self-sufficiency that would then inform other kinds of conversations and efforts around how to best meet the needs of individuals within the community. And so I just want to stress that this standard allows the agency to paint a full picture of the family and the community profiles of their customers. Additionally, the information gathering process creates an opportunity for the agency to identify new potential partners and to develop new relationships. And so there are various ways that a community action agency might gather information from these groups. Examples of these processes might include key informant interviews, staff participation in community groups, community-wide processes, focus groups, surveys, summaries of conversations or findings related to various individuals from the respective sectors. And so, yes, so there is that point related to that. There is no requirement for how many individual organizations that the Community Action Agency must contact in the collection or the data gathering process, but the key is for those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those 5 sectors mentioned, the community-based organizations, faith-based, private sector, public sector, and educational institutions, that there is representation from each of those sectors mentioned. So there again, guidance on the definition and the intent related to this particular standard can be found in some of our foundational community action resources or history or legislation, so to speak. So I will throw these out: the Economic Opportunity Act, the Community Services Block Grant, the Office of Economic Opportunity Instruction and Information Memorandum 49, which I have already spoken about in the previous standard. And so there again, you would find in the actual toolkit specific references and the language that comes from these that, as I said, provided the guidance and inspiration for the definition and more particularly the intent that we have already kind of spoken to. All right, so let's see if I can get this next slide to cooperate. It's giving me a challenge, Cashin. Oh, here it is. And so let's talk a little bit about guidance on compliance and documentation related to this slide. So examples of scenarios that might prompt further review, and these are examples related to this standard, are information gathered for the community assessment process is only from a subset of the sectors. So I've already mentioned that all of those sectors must be represented in the assessment process. The information gathered from the 5 sectors do not span the agency's entire service area. So, for example, let's say, for example, for those agencies who serve multiple counties, for example, it would likely get some attention if you're only just, maybe you serve 5 counties, but you only have representation for one of those counties. It doesn't paint that full picture that you need in order to understand the community needs and available resources for the families and individuals being served by the agency. The other that might prompt a little more attention is that the organization only gathers information related to needs. And here's the key thing to understand as it relates to the community assessment process. The community assessment process is not only designed to understand what the customer's needs are, but it's also designed to help the agency understand what the available resources are, and in particular to understand available resources from the perspective of those various sectors mentioned in this standard. Just strengthens the agency's ability to meet the needs of the community more comprehensively. And then, you know, the other aspect of that community assessment process is, in addition to understanding the needs and available resources, it also gives an opportunity for the agency in conversation with its community partners to understand what the barriers are so that there is an informed opportunity to address those in an effective manner. So here is some guidance on documentation. And I'll just list these very quickly for us. Summarizing the data in the community assessment or its appendices, for example, a listing of all stakeholders engaged by sector in the community needs assessment. Providing documentation of phone calls, surveys, interviews, focus groups in CAA files. It could be hard copy or electric. Documentation in planning team meetings or minutes, documentation of planning team minutes, summary reports on the data shared at board meetings or board committees, and then reports from key partners, whether those are written or online. And so thinking about beyond compliance, activities that might possibly sort of take an agency beyond compliance might be to establish a process that routinely collects information from other sectors. And so versus that being a process that maybe occurs every other year or every 3 years or even once a year, maybe there are multiple stops along the way that are consistent, that sort of keeps that line of communication flowing between that feedback communication flowing from those various sectors. Additionally, other considerations might be to implement a clear process to synthesize the data collected from the various sectors. And so that would be that. And so, in addition, here are some resources that might support an agency's implementation related to Standard 2.2, the SMART survey design, a community action guide to comprehensive community needs assessments, and the community needs assessment toolkit. So, Cassie, do we have time for questions, or do I need to keep going?
I believe you would have plenty of time because we did actually block it all the way out to 3:30 just in case. However, I have questions that have come in for 2.2, so I think you can go ahead and make the jump.
Awesome. Excuse me. So Standard 2.3. The organization communicates its activities and its results to the community. And so I like this standard. It's about the community action agency telling its story. I'll say it again. It's about the agency telling its story. And this may be accomplished through several different ways. For example, maybe it's through its website, social media campaigns, its annual reports, news releases, op-ed, newspaper articles, public sector or public service announcements, newspaper or community outreach announcements, the announcement of the public agency meetings or special events that are going on for the agency. The key is for the agency to engage in an ongoing communication effort with the community about its impact and key activities of the agency. So the focus or the thing to keep in mind is there is this ongoing communication related to the community actions, impact, and the key activities of the agency. So hopefully I stressed that enough by saying it twice. So while the community can be defined by the community action agency, it needs to include both those external to its staff and the board of the agency. So this standard can actually be achieved in various ways. So let's see, what else do I want to say about that? Here it is. This standard provides an opportunity or really a foundation for community action agencies to build a community agenda to address poverty, which strengthens the case for engagement and investment in anti-poverty efforts by the entire community. And I'll just sum it up in this way, especially for those who have been involved in community action work for a long time. Many of our agencies have been buried in the work. So the needs of our families and our communities are great. And so because those needs are so great and oftentimes urgent, that's what our agencies have given their attention to. However, as we think about this particular standard, it basically calls us to continue doing that good work that we're doing, but as we're doing that work, to find a way to toot our own horns or to share that story to inform the community, which provides an opportunity for the community to own a stake, so to speak, in the efforts that are taking place by that particular community or that community action agency. So the communication of the community action agency's overall story from services for clients to achieved outcomes to coordinated efforts with partners provides funders, policymakers, and the press with more information that supports the agency's credibility and basically provides the entire community, and I stress the entire community with a holistic picture of the community action agency as the critical anti-poverty agent in the community. Furthermore, the story says it all. There's nothing more powerful than the agency having that opportunity on an ongoing basis to tell its own story so that when in doubt, as I mentioned, those policymakers or those funders or other individuals can just pick up on that story that has been told or that they know to strengthen the impact of the work being facilitated by that agency in the community. So here are some additional examples of the ways that the story might be conveyed. It might be conveyed also through community needs assessment, through the sharing of the community action plan, by sharing the agency's strategic plan, by providing a program or services brochure or flyer, providing regular meeting and community events announcements, and certainly constantly promoting opportunities for volunteers. So putting out those volunteer recruitment announcements or advertisements for even further engagement. So there are some more examples that are found in the toolkit that can give even some more insight as it relates to that. And so let's talk a little bit about guidance on compliance and documentation. And so as it relates to this one, I am choosing to emphasize here that maybe something that would trigger a little more investigation related to compliance to this standard is that the organization only communicates its activities to the community. And so maybe what I would add to that is it communicates its activities to the community, but it doesn't necessarily speak about its impact. Okay, so this standard is about more than saying we're having a block party for community kids to promote healthy lifestyle choices. It's more than that. It's about also talking about how people are being helped and how lives are being changed, talking about the impact, sharing that data that, the examples that were just mentioned might offer. So, of course, our strategic plan updates or our return on investment reports or agency impact or fact sheets or program outcome or output reports would provide that kind of data that would be helpful in giving the community a more in-depth picture of the significance of the work being facilitated by the Community Action Agency. And so you see under documentation, there's some other examples, and I think I've kind of already mentioned some of those, but I'll mention them again that you might provide as an organization to support this. So those annual reports, making those available, an easy way to make them available is on the website. Maybe some of our agencies don't have websites. For the agency to have a website and also to provide documentation of social media activity through our various social media outlets, to share stories that have been published in the media, to share news release copies, certainly to offer those community event announcements with documentation of those, and to also share the agency's community action plan. So let's talk a little bit more about going beyond compliance. And so possible considerations might be for the agency to offer standing or consistent methods or conveying key information to the community. And so for that agency to think more strategically about how that happens and to facilitate that consistently and reliably so that the community would look for that information or look to receive those updates to remain connected and informed to the work of the Community Action Agency and more specifically to the community itself. Another consideration for taking things to the next level might be the agency's development of a comprehensive communication strategy. And so there again, sort of thinking about all the ways that communication can happen to not only increase the breadth or sort of the number of people who might receive information about the agency's activities and its impact, but also the depth of the information shared. So, more meaningful information is shared in the communication process. And so there are a wealth of resources that have been provided related to this standard. So there's a webinar facilitated by the partnership called Social Media 01, advocacy, storytelling, and important reminders. There is a brochure called Telling Community Action Story. There's a communications planning guide. Yet another webinar, how to create an annual report people will actually read. That seems interesting to me. And still there is an issue brief on social return on investment, and then just some tools that agencies might use to kind of help provide or share their data in a more interactive kind of manner, so utilizing infographics. And so there's a link that we provide to how to create an infographic for your agency, or what are called word clouds or wordles. And so there again, another tool to kind of engage the audiences that the agency is trying to reach in a more impactful manner. So that concludes section or standard 2.3. Are there any questions?
Yes, looks like we have one or two that have come in. First up, is the communication plan the same thing as a marketing plan?
I would venture to say my response is yes. Yeah, that would be my response to that, yes.
Great, and also here we have, could you explain what you mean by media files and provide examples?
Okay, and let me go back to the marketing plan. One, I would say, maybe it sort of depends on sort of the definition of the marketing plan, but, I think that there's some strong alignment between marketing plan, communication plan. So certainly when I've thought about this whole notion of communications, or as we thought about the notion of communications plan, it's more than just sort of advertising the agency's activities. So yeah, it's about finding those dynamic ways to tell those stories of impact, and it also speaks to how I think relationships might be leveraged to maybe engage in effective disbursement of key resources or information available from the local agency perspective. And so that's my take on it. Yes, but I think the notion of the marketing plan is very closely aligned to communications plan. So, Captain, say the other question again. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure I have it.
Sure. The other was noting that you had talked about media files. What exactly did you mean by that, and can you give examples?
Right, and so that really more so has to do with, let's say, for example, your agency, someone from your agency writes an op-ed article. It would be providing copies, of those articles, or, maybe it is a news interview or something, or trying to think of another sort of media or press-related kind of thing, but really it's just the documentation that the agency would provide to prove that type of communication occurred.
Great, thanks for those additional notes there. So that is all I see around Standard 2.3, so I think we can go ahead and try to hit our home stretch here with Standard 2.4.
Okay, Standard 2.4. Is there any cheering in the background? Woo! Ah! Woo! Let me read it. The organization documents the number of volunteers and hours mobilized in support of its activities. And so the information referenced in this standard is also reported annually by agencies through the information survey or the IS report. And so when we tell the story about the impact of community action, it's important to note that volunteers, and particularly the documentation of the number of volunteer hours served, is very, very important. It's so important, I'm going to say this again. When we are telling the story about the impact of community action, volunteers, and particularly the documentation of the number of volunteer hours served, is hugely critical. Annually, over 24 million hours of volunteer services are donated to community action agencies nationally. This is one of the important elements of how community action agencies, but also how the Community Action Network tells the story of impact, and here it is, the leveraging of volunteer hours and other resources in the community. This is a critical data element for local community action agencies, and as I've already referred to our national partners as our story is conveyed. Just to go ahead and get to the punch on that, it provides a foundation or a basis for the agencies and the network as a whole to show how we are able to leverage a maximum number of available resources in the community, which at the end of the day yields those wonderful ROI, or return on investment results that we look to. Whether it's in the nonprofit or public or business sector, there are very few entities that want to invest or attribute their resources towards an effort and the impact of that investment to just come out to be that same amount. People want to see their resources sort of serving as a seed, and those seeds blossoming into other critical points of impact or transformation for communities served. And so I say again, to be able to have the documentation of those volunteer hours, which is basically free labor, that comes with a cost, so to speak, when we are telling the story of our impact, or when we are telling what the return on investment is for the communities that are being served. So let's talk a little bit about guidance on compliance and documentation. So here it is. Lack of documentation of the volunteer hours. And so the agency might say, well, we have volunteers. Maybe the agency is able to provide a listing of individuals who have served as volunteers. But as I have already emphasized, the important piece in the process is to not only have the volunteers, but to be able to document the number of hours, because then those number of hours served across the various aspects of the agency translate themselves into money. So I'm sure that there are many people on this webinar today who have heard of the concept, time is money. And when it comes to the volunteers who are serving our agencies, their time equals money that gets translated into these wonderful positive statements of return on investment for our agencies as a whole. And so examples of possible documentation might include data on the number of volunteers and hours provided, documentation of board minutes that also convey that information, or documentation of the tracking system. So it might be a manual tracking system where there are sign-in sheets or things like that provided, and that is analyzed or there may be agencies that have more sophisticated systems in place that, let's say, for example, volunteers are able to log in via the computer or the internet, log in their hours, what their activity was, all of those things to be able to provide a more sophisticated story of, what happened, and basically for that data to be able to be captured and documented. So I kind of got off at a tangent with that statement. Really the key to that documentation piece for that is that there's documentation of the tracking system. So that elaboration that I just offered maybe is maybe one example of going beyond compliance. So I apologize for getting ahead of myself as it related to that, because not every agency is going to be able to do that. But speaking of beyond compliance, the volunteer data might include the program area supported by the volunteer support. And so taking it to another level, certainly compliance is having the volunteers and documenting their hours, but going beyond that might be able to sort of show specifically where those hours donated has impacted specific programmatic areas within the life of the agency to show that individual or programmatic-based impact or programmatic return on investment as a result of those free work hours provided. Because time is money, but it's provided for free. But like I said, it's calculated investment-wise into real dollars. And here is a listing of some possible resources that might support an agency's implementation of this standard. There's a website resource called Calculating the Economic Impact of Volunteers, and then also a tool, Community Action Partnership of Lancaster and Saunders County's online volunteer management website. So that concludes Standard 2.4. Are there any questions?
All right, I don't see any questions that have come in through 2.4, but we will take a moment here in case there are any late breaking on either 2.4 or across any of the community engagement standards that we may not have gotten to. I do want to encourage you to make sure that this is not the end of the conversation. You have all of our contacts here for the staff of the organizational standards, as well as Tiffany, because she is our writer on this particular one. So reach out to any of us. We will be glad to handle any questions. And as well, make sure that you are, in fact, talking to your state CSBG lead agency. They are the final arbiter on all documentation and intent and monitoring issues, as well as your state association, as they often conduct trainings or can work with a peer, give you examples from others in your area. So make sure that you are reaching out to either the national or your state or state association contacts. Again, I wanted to note that this particular guide is not yet posted as of today, September the 17th. However, it will be coming out in the next week or two. We will put up the recording and the slides used today up on our website tomorrow. And with that, I think any closing thoughts, Tiffany, that you wanted to leave everybody with?
Thank you very much for your attention, and we wish you well in the implementation of these standards.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.